I was tasked with the job, I think, of putting the book in a little bit of context from the departmental perspective. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I think that Ying Qian and her book fits in the context of our department. And I think I confess I'm framing this a little bit in terms of reading a book called Babel, An Arcane History. Anybody reading R.F. Kuang's book? Paul's nodding from the background. It's a book about Oxford and a translators institute at Oxford that is very critical of especially Asian studies. And so I think it's important to think a little bit about the East Asian Languages and Cultures department here had a very different background than a place like Oxford, which came out of a colonial empire. In fact, our department, the first position here was funded by a Chinese person living in the States who wanted to see China studied. And I think that's a pretty unique start to a regional studies program. But the other thing that, and we're celebrating now our 125th anniversary. And when I was looking at Ying Qian's book and thinking about the context, and knowing that the first Chinese documentary film, the first documentary film about China was aired in or shown in 1911, I realized that it was about 100 years later that we started a position in Chinese film at Columbia University. And so I think there's a kind of catching up that happens. And the same thing happened to me in Tibetan studies, right? Tibet became part of the world's intellectual kind of context when the British invaded in 1903, 1904. And almost exactly 100 years later, the Luce Foundation, a big media conglomerate that then funded a family foundation, funded a position here. So I see this in this larger context. And of course, East Asian Languages and Cultures really only became a major department after World War II, when we did inherit a little bit of British role in kind of paying attention to the world. And people like Ted DeBerry and Donald Keene came back from war, and same where I trained at Harvard, where Fairbanks and others, Reischauer, and they came back from war and needed to develop these regional studies institutes. So I think there's obviously there's not a kind of magical 100-year lag time in studying topics that Chinese film became more and more important over time, and paying attention to China became more and more important over time. And that's why Ying is the cutting edge of the East Asian Languages and Cultures program's attention to media studies. We have Takuya here in Japanese film. We've talked about developing a position in Korean film. Of course, I'd love to see that for Tibetan studies at some point. Tibetan film. We've had a lot of activities this year because the first Tibetan filmmaker, Pema Tseiden, passed away, and we've been celebrating his life, this year. But I think that seeing Ying Qian and her work come to fruition 100 years, plus a little bit, after the advent of Chinese film, there's a kind of satisfying historical echo to that. So those are my comments, and I turn it over now to Jane Kay. Oh, sorry. One more thing I wanted to say, because I serve on the Columbia University Press editorial board. We were so excited when the book came out. And the academic community has responded similarly, but I just wanted to say, because the inner workings of these committees is sometimes hidden, but it was a thrill for us when your book came out. So thank you.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue to the press, because it's a little strange tonight. We have actually two launches, and I want to be sure that Phil Leventhal, our intrepid editor at Columbia Press, gets a shout out, because we had in the Investigating Visible Evidence series an online, for the first book, online Zoom in 2022. So if it happened on Zoom, it didn't exactly happen. So Ying's book is the second in the series. And so tonight it's the series in-person launch and a book a terribly important book, and I'm about to tell you why. It is so important because the concept of visible evidence has a long legacy that links up with the center, for me, the center and the core and the exciting, explosive middle of revolutionary becomings, which is the way in which a field, what we call documentary film and media studies, began a set of conferences after the Rodney King disaster of the trials, in which the police officers were, because of the visible evidence of the video being discounted, they were acquitted. And the conference was named, the first 1993 conference was named after visible evidence. But here's where Ying comes in. Basically, we started a Minnesota Press series called Visible Evidence, Collecting Visible Evidence. And that series ran its course, and we were basically having conferences worldwide every year since 1993. And it was in the Melbourne conference in 2012 that I met Ying Qian. And what's interesting about that is that 30 years into the conference, we are going to Melbourne again in December. But what's exciting to me, and I haven't told her this before, is that the reception of this particular book within that conference, and these are the religious readers of film books about documentary, is there will be so much excitement because she brings us back to the core of the issue and the problem of what came to be called, in a watered down format, social change. Now, it really isn't social change. It's the revolutionary connection to Zika Vertov in the Soviet case. And many of us in the field felt like there was nothing more that could be said about the Soviets. So Ying knows that for years, we kept saying, what was the connection between China and the Soviets? And in this one volume, she in fact has demonstrated for us that the Soviets were not the only case. So when we talk about social change, we really need to be talking about revolutionary overthrow, and to use her terms, revolutionary processes, because we're still stuck with a really difficult theoretical problem of what is the connection between the emerging technological new and social movements that want to overthrow the existing. But what's thrilling to me is that she brought the terms together so that if she says, for instance, revolution and media are now mutually constitutive, then this says to us in the field that's been a very leftist field for its entire existence as a subset of film and media studies. Now we can't possibly extricate the two. And this means that it's now on us to read this book. I think it's on us in a field to learn Chinese history, because we'll have to learn the first 1911 revolution, then we'll also have to learn the second Chinese revolution, the one between 1949 and 1989, that ongoing, that includes the Cultural Revolution. But here's what's most exciting for me. If we dismiss, because of Stalin and the Cold War, the question of agitation, and we took agitprop not seriously anymore, she's put back propaganda as something that we have to attend to. And we have to think in new terms about something that, talk about a century, that's over a century old. And we can't just say that there's a likelihood that people will pick up new instruments when the movement comes to a point where people want to become a mass movement. We need better terms, and she's giving us a reignition of the study of media as deployed for people's struggles worldwide. Now, I want to just go a little further, because I was also thrilled with the 1911 date, because I also am very dedicated in my own project to the Workers' Film and Photo League and Pokino, which is Japan. The idea that this is a Japanese film that excites the Chinese about the Chinese Revolution in 1911. And also, I want to call attention to the aspect of this book that's so archival. If Ying is theorizing documentary as revolutionary media, and giving us the terms mediation work, revolutionary processes, as I said before, she's also giving us texts that we had not been able to locate because of what I call the huge blackout, the time when British and American and French scholars could not see what was in the archives in basically in all of former PRC, which is still a PRC, or even in Taiwan, and also Moscow. So what excited me in reading this book is to get the backstory on a film like Long Live the Nations. And Long Live the Nations, which I know that Professor Ying Qian titled. She worked with the Taiwan Archive, where it is basically the print is archived, and gave us this amazing 1938 film that then we have to take a look at, 1941, pardon me, as oddly echoing a tradition that's both British and American. And I think that she's very astute in her book by saying, look, there's a way in which this long tradition is connected. And if Long Live the Nations seems to echo Pierre Lawrence's The River and films made in the UK by the Grierson Empire Marketing Board, then we have to look again closer into the archive, and we've got to completely change our historical account. World cinema has got to be, after this book, completely rearranged. And I want to give her also a shout out for the concept of the event. And the introduction to this book just gives a little bit of the challenge in making a series around investigating visible evidence, because the definition keeps changing and shifting. So she's giving us a wonderful new definition of the event, the before the camera, the during the camera shooting, the collective working together, and then she calls this eventful. So I add to all of the approaches that we have in the future, this wonderful approach that's both an overview, an overview of a cultural shift, but also a very historical overview, a very tight theoretical intervention for which we thank her profusely.
Thank you, Jane. And now you, please.
Yes, I want to thank all of you for being here. I really see this as a celebration of the communities and friendships that have nurtured my growth and have made this book possible. And so thank you. And I thank my home department, actually, many of you are here. And also my editor, Philip Leventhal, is there. And yeah, so I'm really overwhelmed by this occasion. So I just wanted to lay out the book very quickly for you. So the book begins in 1895, the year of cinema's invention and China's defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, which radically changed the power of configuration in East Asia and precipitated the first waves of revolutionary agitations that ultimately toppled the Qing dynasty in 1911, and sort of go on to build a republic. The chapters, as you can see, covers a large variety of documentaries in all arenas of life, from transnational productions of news films on revolutionary insurgency and war to industrial films training new workers and teaching experimental technologies during the Great Leap Forward, to reels of documentary evidence at the trial of the Gang of Four in the post-Mao decade. The epilogue brings the narrative to contemporary independent documentary. So the book is certainly a history of documentary cinema in China, but its ambition goes beyond writing a film history. Rather, it wants to use documentary as a prism to investigate the mutual constitution of media and radical political movements. So how these movements, right, call for mediation to mold political relationalities and to form knowledge to direct the movement's further action. And then how the specific media practices that have been called into existence also then propelled specific unfoldings of the revolutionary process. So specificity here is very important. I'm looking at specific media practices that molded specific political relations and create specific knowledge. And I'm interested in thinking about how media goes, is foundational to the unfolding of revolutionary processes, and the actualization of revolutionary potentials is sometimes stifled crippling of revolutionary potentials. And so by doing so, it really asserts media's central role in social change and writes media history into political and social histories. And I think, the emphasis on history and on thinking of the Chinese society or Eastern Asian society as in an integral manner is really something that the East Asian Department is committed in doing. So revolutionaries have long understood the importance of media in their endeavors. So for Lenin, the newspaper provides infrastructure for revolutionary organization as well as knowledge formation, scaffolding, and the thread that connects the party, creates the party organization. Likewise, in 1896, reformer Liang Qichao also compared newspaper and the information flow it created to blood circulation vital for the health of the body politic. So launching a Marxist revolution where the material preconditions for it, for the revolution hardly existed, the Maoist mass line posited the Chinese Communist Party explicitly as the mediator to mend the contradiction between Marxist revolutionary theory and China's historical circumstances, and in the process constitute both the party and the masses. And here it's important again to note that neither the party nor the masses nor the policies nor the ideologies were treated as fixed entities in this book, and this is very important. And I think this is what media studies can really bring to to thinking politically about China. The importance of media lie exactly in the fact that these entities were mutually constituted and made through the process of mediation, and therefore, in what ways the mediation creates inclusive or exclusive political relations, and what kind of knowledge it creates, then decides on what the party could be, what the masses could be, and what the prevailing norms would be. So documentary was particularly amenable to a media approach because it was so omnipresent in the society. It was, made outside of the studios. And this book proposes to think about it as an eventful media. And by doing so, it urges us to think, first of all, of documentary itself as events that bring together actors and change the power dynamics on the ground. And second, to think about documentary inscriptions of events that erupt in the broader society and therefore shaping how these evanescent events take hold. And taking hold, again, is important, right? Because the revolution often has eruptions of things that's really new, and whether it take hold or not is uncertain, and how, right? And so there are some examples I want to show in the book, and I'll stop. For example, revolutionary and the filmmaker, they build infrastructures and network together. The Japanese filmmaker Umeya Shokichi benefited from Sun Yat-sen's transnational revolutionary networks to create Japan's leading early film operation. And his company not only filmed the 1911 revolution, but funded it with hot cash from film exhibition. Documentary was also proudly partisan in 1920s. They not only propagated party ideologies among rivaling parties, but also built the party by creating new party rituals and helping recruit members. Japanese bombing of Shanghai in 1932 brought Shanghai filmmakers in hopeless competition with Euro-American newsreel correspondents in terms of access and infrastructure, and brought Shanghai filmmakers to reflect on the politics of visibility, which is central to left-wing film movements. So thinking about documentary as eventful also helps us hone in on documentary's two important mediating roles: the political relationality, molding it, and knowledge formation. So I proposed an eventful reading. Sorry, this is Zhen Jingli's. I proposed eventful reading of documentary, propaganda documentary, focusing on questions whose visions, scripts, and directions were followed, what inclusions and exclusions were involved in the production process so that we could both move beyond a Cold War interpretation of Cold War just as centralized control and brainwashing, but at the same time retain evaluative capacity to think about propaganda's political, ethical, and epistemological implications. I also use eventful reading to scrutinize solidarity films, affirming the aspiration for solidarity, but also critiquing power structures, hierarchies that hindered it. Finally, I ask what revolution requires epistemologically. Revolutionary processes are inherently open, contingent, and difficult to navigate, despite the effort made to create stability and teleology for them. So as an epistemological media, documentary had two tendencies with historical practices of process film and mapping and diagramming and forensics. Documentary is apt at creating stable categories and procedures for decision-making. At the same time, documentary is also a media attuned to the emergent, open-ended, and contingent developments that may be too new to have a name. And so I wrote about how during the Great Leap Forward, the socialist process films was pushed to its logical extreme with the practice of documenting tomorrow, and also showed documentary entered a crisis, became anti-event during the Cultural Revolution, not responding to emergent contradictions in the society, but rather reproducing the old class categories that could not be found in real life. And thinking with Alain Badiou on event, I critiqued his assessment of Cultural Revolution on his own terms. And so finally, I just want to say that a few weeks ago, I gave a talk at the Light Industry, talking to an audience of media activists and community organizers who are eager to think about media in today's political world. And I think the readers will decide how the lessons and achievements and lessons from China's 20th century can be relevant to contemporary times. And I'm simply grateful to be in the conversation. So thank you.
Congratulations, Ying. I have read many different versions of the chapters. I'm sure Jane and others have also. It's just wonderful to have the finished product, here. This book is a major contribution to a number of fields: Chinese film studies, documentary media, and Chinese political history. When we think of documentaries, we tend to picture a medium of representation, especially those of us outside film studies, thinking of a camera rolling as events unfold and the camera capturing what's unfolding. But Ying invites us to rethink the whole idea. She argues that documentary films were actually actively involved in the Chinese Revolution, and they didn't just capture history, they made history. In those 6 chapters, Ying provides tons of evidence and brilliant analysis to show how documentary films shaped China's revolutions and were shaped by them for a long time span, from the close to the fall of the Qing dynasty to the Cultural Revolution and post-Cultural Revolution. She starts the book with a scene that is in the introduction that immediately hooked me. It's the 1911 premiere of the film she just mentioned, The Chinese Revolution, in a theater in Nagasaki, Japan. Just think about this: a packed house of Chinese students, fresh from their studies in Tokyo, sitting in sitting in the audience as the film rolls, showing revolutionary soldiers on the screen. These students start waving flags, shouting and cheering. One student runs to the front of the theater, announcing that he's no longer a Qing subject, that he's now a revolutionary. The film they watched was the first of a series of 3 films produced, called The Chinese Revolutionary, shot on site in China, that documented the unfolding of the 1911 revolution from the outbreak of the insurgency in Wuchang in October to the inauguration of Sun Yat-sen as the provisional president in December. Filmmakers like progressive Japanese filmmaker Umeya Shokichi, who made the film, were themselves political actors. Umeya was deeply involved in Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary activities. And what does Ying want us to take from this? Right from the start, we see that documentaries were never just about recording what was happening, but what themselves political events. This is what she's said, eventful media. And they weren't just showing the revolution. They were helping to make it. This idea of a documentary as an agent of revolution runs throughout the chapters. In the first chapter, Ying takes us through the early days of Chinese documentary filmmaking. From here, she dives into the 30s and 40s, where we see how documentaries were used as propaganda tools during the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. In the second chapter, she discusses two kinds of documentary aesthetics that emerged during this time, what she calls hard and soft documentaries. I don't have the time to go into this. Jane just mentioned Zheng Junli's film which was crucial in mediating the relationship between the Nationalist Party and regional power holders in China. What is so interesting is that Zheng Junli's film, Long Live the Nations, wasn't just about showing one unified vision of China. There were competing political visions within the film, and it had to balance these different ideas while still pushing the broader agenda of national unity. Ying's book focuses on Chinese documentary filmmakers, but she has extensive discussions of their interactions with international filmmakers, Dutch filmmaker, even Soviet filmmaker, Roman Karman, and other filmmakers. So you have a global picture of Chinese documentary filmmaking. My favorite chapter is chapter 4. Called When Taylorism Met Revolutionary Romanticism. And this is the chapter on the Great Leap Forward. And the chapter dives very deep into the heart of the Great Leap Forward. It isn't like anything you're going to read, you have read about the Great Leap Forward. It's and for those of you who don't know, it was a radical political campaign that aimed to catapult China into the modern industrial giant that it aspired to be, by fusing two seemingly opposite ideas, Taylorism, a disciplined, time-efficient method of industrial management, and revolutionary romanticism. Ying has a wonderful analysis of the conflict, the tension between the two. And she makes it clear that the Great Leap Forward wasn't just about accelerating industrial production output. It was about creating a whole new sense of time and purpose for the Chinese people. One thing I really loved about this chapter is how it shows that documentary films played a crucial role in building this new revolutionary time, what she calls the Great Leap Forward temporality. And this again is tied into the idea of eventful media, a dimension of creating a new concept of time. And this is perfect for filmmaking. And how do you film the future? A documentary film about the future. And this is, I really enjoyed reading your analysis. So now, these films portrayed workers not only meeting production targets, but surpassing them in ways that seemed impossible. It was as if future was already present in the form of revolutionary energy. And so this great idea of great leap temporalities try to represent a sense of time that was almost out of joint. It was impossible. And that raises the question here is what Ying calls the disruption of documentary film and the creation of docufiction, artistic documentary film. This is very interesting, the blurring of documentation and filmmaking here. I might have a question for you later. One of the most compelling aspects of Ying's book is she always works, looks at how these films were made, who made them, and what kind of political, economic, social structures were in place that shaped the creation of these films. And I'm almost done. And she has a talent for bringing these documentaries to life on the page. So you can almost see the images she's describing. You don't need to be a scholar of film or Chinese history to get a lot out of this book. If you are, there's so much depth to delve into. Here's finally, let me make a sales pitch. Revolutionary Becomings is a must read for anyone who wants to understand the interplay between media and revolution. It is not just a book back at the history of modern China. It is a book that makes you think about the ongoing power of images that shapes our collective future. Two questions. One, how did you grapple with the ephemeral existence of some of the early documentary films, many of which were lost to time? I think you have a little bit of discussion of that, but I think our graduate students who work with archives might benefit from your experience in thinking about. Second, the fabulation of documentary media, precisely the boundary between fiction making and documentary media. On page 158, you mentioned that this kind of docufiction, like artistic documentaries, were produced, and they amounted to 47% of the total film production in that year. So I'm really curious. I'm more interested in your theoretical reflections on this. And so the blurring of boundaries is always fascinating, because that is where the boundaries become visible or invisible. And I wonder if you could reflect on this, just these two questions.
Ray's left us, so I'm just going to jump in next. And it's a pleasure. Oh, before I begin, I want to copy Debashri Mukherjee. Any graduate student asks a question, you can have a free copy of the book. I learned that the other day. It's a pleasure to be able to read this book. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. I'm going to situate it somewhat in the longer history of propaganda, to think of the other ways of thinking about this, because, you know, if you look at the book, it says documentary media in 20th century China. It's a book about film dominantly, but film conceived of as media, partly because then Ian also wants to conceive of the Revolutionary Party as a media form itself. They both mediate, and it puts pressure on what that process of mediation is. But if you look at the longer history of documentary, or of propaganda in particular, it's a very American history, we know. We have the rise of the mass. You have this libidinal, excessive energy of this anomic, uprooted people who come to the city, the rise of mass society, mass urbanization, mass sports, mass entertainments like film. And so in America, with the work of Walter Lippmann, with the whole rise of political theory, theorizing the mass, propaganda is key. Because when you have this unruly group, how are you going to guide it? How are you going to mobilize it? And the long history of media theory, not film theory, in the US comes from this question of propaganda. we sit in Columbia. Columbia was the center of this theorization with Paul Lazarsfeld in the Bureau of Applied Social Research, whose all of his work was around propaganda. Well, not all of his work, but the basic foundation of it was. You know, myself and Ying are part of the Center for Comparative Media, Jane as well, Lydia as well. And comparative media is looking, one part is looking at media globally. But the origins in the US of looking at global media came out of Columbia and the Bureau of Applied Social Research, because after the Second World War, it was very clear the Middle East, Asia, and Africa was about to become independent. And what were they going to do? Would they become communists? Would they become capitalists? And how can we influence opinion? How can we use propaganda? Who's using propaganda? So there's this lineage of thinking propaganda that is really woven into media theory. And the history we get here is absolutely different. It gives us a different lineage. She speaks at one point, writes at one point, the provincializing, you know, documentary film, provincializing propaganda. And that's what we get, a very counter narrative. Because one of the main things which everyone has said so far for Ying, it is this imbrication of revolution and film. There is no history of revolution in which film does not operate. There is no history of film in China in which the revolution wasn't central to it. They are mutually constitutive. So it's not as if it's an optional thing. Let's look at how it was used revolutionary. Film is woven, or revolution is woven into the ontology of film. So what the book gives us is really a history of documentary and a history of political revolutions in China's, when you really, I'm not a Chinese specialist by any means, incredibly dramatic 20th century. And she's using that to give us a theory of film. In a way, it's not just a recounting of that history. In there is a theory of what film is and how we need to understand it. So to give one example of this, we could look at the theory of the mass. So the mass, you know, in political theory, it's a political constitution of a certain polity that comes at a certain point in history. In media theory, it's an after effect of the media. Media theory has always wanted to claim that it creates collectives. You know, the rise of the public sphere is based on print. The imagined communities of nationalism are based on print capitalism. The emergence of the mass is based on the rise of electronic media, of newspapers, the broadcast dissemination of a centralized message to a now passive mass that receives that message. These are after effects of the very operations of media itself. So both political theory, revolutionary theory, which seeks to mobilize masses and seeks to constitute masses, are all claiming the same terrain in a certain way. And it comes together in the film that both Jane and Lydia mentioned, which is Long Live the Nations, which I thought, and because partly what Ying is giving us is not just an analysis of the contents, but doing the archival work that gives us the production process itself. So in Long Live the Nation, they have to shoot in Inner Mongolia this major scene, which requires thousands of people. It requires 3,000 to 4,000 cattle. It requires hundreds and hundreds of yurts, of tents. It is a staging of the spectacle of the masses. But there's not many people in Inner Mongolia, especially near the borderlands. So you have to mobilize people from an enormous region to do it. And as Lydia was mentioning, that means mobilizing local elites from different areas and driving people there. So the very act of constituting the mass, so the mass in revolutionary theory is the object of address. By watching the propaganda film, you are awoken to political consciousness and you're addressed as a mass, and that address constitutes you as a mass. In the idea of it, what Ying shows, and it's really remarkable because I've never seen this argument before, that the actual work of staging the mass is what constitutes the practical politics. Also, the fact that you've got, I think, what is it? Chinese nationalists, a Qinghai warlord, Mongolian nobles, a Tibetan Rinpoche, all of these various different polities who are mobilized in order to bring about this spectacle of the mass, is that the work of constituting that is in the production process as much as it is in the address itself. So that you only get that from serious archival research, and it's an interesting way of looking at, you know, what we might look at the politics of the production process as well as the film itself. And so my last point on this is just that Ying's work sits along with Jane's work and others in an explosion of work in film theory that moves away from the history of narrative cinema to looking at the enormous amount of non-narrative films, industrial films, colonial films, propaganda films, all sorts that were produced throughout the 20th century. And part of that challenge is, for the longest time in the West, there was this presumption that film was tied to the commodity form. If you look at the work of Jonathan Crary here, look at the work of Jonathan Beller, of Sean Cubitt, to some degree, Benjamin and Krakauer, the film is ontologically caught up with the history of the commodity. The Lumiere brothers were entrepreneurs. They were selling machinery, but they were also shooting and exhibiting films to make money. And that the history of the transference of the commodity into a spectacle fit form, the management of attention, the elicitation of desire, the management of effect, cinema was constitutive, Crary would say, to the emergency of the society of spectacle. So much so that there's an immanence between the commodity form and cinema itself. And there's an august line of film theory that makes this argument. What Ying is giving us is an absolutely alternative theory of the history of cinema, which is one in which politics is constitutive of film form, not the commodity. The commodity is there. Certainly the surround is the French and the Americans and Pathé and other newsreels coming in. But the line she draws through it is it's the political exchange through this concept of mediation that links the history of documentary. Thank you.
Wow, okay, there's not much left to be said. Thank you so much for inviting me, Ying, and the Heman Center, and all the organizers and colleagues. And it's wonderful to revisit this university again after several years. So I would just begin with actually huge congratulations others have. And also by actually a pitch, sort of a cell pitch. I will focus more on the work's landmark status and incredible contribution to Chinese language cinema studies and curriculum expansion. You have spoken from the film media perspective and Chinese political history, world revolution histories. I have actually this semester adopted Chen Ying's book as probably the only book that's to be read by my students cover to cover. So the course is called the Sinophone Documentaries, the History, Theory, Practice. I taught this several times before and always was searching for the textbook that would start the debate until we get to the contemporary independent documentary production that has been more well-known in the past decade and so, right, in terms of its output, but also the studies of it. Many dissertations and monographs and so on have been produced. And Chen Ying herself has written extensively about this subject. But in order to really create a long view of this history of Chinese language documentaries, it was so hard to really locate right, useful, and important text. And this is the first of its kind, really. So thank you for bringing this to our classroom, to our field. And last Friday, Ying visited my class, and we had the privilege of having sort of a more open-ended discussion about the book. And the students all read it from cover to cover, literally, and then myself included. So I had a lot of marginalia and notes. And I also would have shared, in addition to sort of the important contribution to my classroom and the field of Chinese film studies, as Brian just rightly commented. So far, so much cinema studies have been concentrating on narrative cinema, on the commodity form, but very little, especially in East Asian cinema studies, I have to observe, and less so more with Euro-American nonfiction studies that's been going on and growing for a long time. So in addition to books by Bill Nichols and Michael Chana and Jen Gans and so on, there's very little theoretically very consolidated work in Sinophone Chinese language studies in this area. So this is a really major landmark sort of events. Now I shifted to a little bit of the personal relation to this book. So as someone who studied journalism, was trained to be the party propaganda mouthpiece back in China in the 80s. I'm impressed by the way that Ying has really dissected and performed this forensic examination of the Chinese PRC propaganda apparatus, not simply caricaturing it as a lot of have done, and not simply creating a sort of description of it, but really going inside and opening up its multifaceted implications and impact in all spheres of Chinese life. So the term, along with many other terms that you grapple with and reinvestigate, recharge, we use the word in the seminars, right? You recharge this language of prison house with new meanings, with new life forces. And one word that sticks out very quickly for me is as a party, mouthpiece, tranny, and the term dangmei, party media. We use it today too to refer to CCTV and so on and so forth, but you really historicize it. And me and my students as well was really impressed by this deconstruction and the reconstruction of the genealogy of party media from the very early decades on, and not just simply always tied with the CCP in the socialist period. So this is just one instance of a lot of the takeaways from the book, and not just sort of a lot of the films. We're able to now have in-depth analysis to work with, but also a lot of the terminologies and terms, proper names and so on that have been taken for granted or banished to history, as being, or kidnapped by certain ideological sort of functions. You kind of return the historical face to them. And it will create further conversations along this line. Another thing I'm also very much both enormously impressed, but also learning from you is how to handle this epic scale of the project, the whole 20th century, right? And I know that you wrote a dissertation on the socialist period, the sort of the later chapters, envisioning realities, but to backtrack, to throw this long historical sort of view to this broader landscape by adding crucial these first two chapters. I think is enormously critical to the project. Otherwise, the term revolution and the media will have much limited implications as we see now in your book. The periodization created this continuum between the Republican period and the so-called socialist, the 17 years period, which is very, very bold move. Many dissertations and students here also know that sort of conventionally in East Asian studies, there's, and in Chinese studies, modern Chinese studies in particular, there will be sort of taken for granted divisions. Oh, you work on the Republican period, and oh, you work on the sort of contemporary period. And then you'd never meet each other more or less, right? But you bridged this kind of, disciplinary, professional or career-centered sort of periods and sides in order to tell a much wider, bigger, more complex story. And along the way, you reintroduced not just the more typical you call hard revolutionary works, right? And Zheng Junli's, falls more on that side. But as we talked, that his history back in Shanghai and his involvement in the commodity film industry back then, and so on, also is placing him in the more kind of sort of sliding door debate and the practice of documentary media between the hard and soft. And then you added this wonderful component on Liu Na-O in order to illustrate the revolution of the soft media and documentary as well. That was not in your original dissertation, but including it, I really think it's expanded this scope tremendously to allow us to not just see more subgenres and the more different players and agents in creating these Chinese documentary corpus or revolution altogether, but how they have different claims and also they have been impacted differently by what they have been engaged with. Another thing I also thought was very endearing, again, personally and politically, is the chapter on the revolutionary romanticism meeting Taylorism, also one of my favorite chapters. And when I read that, and I read it as this vivid, almost social personal memoir. And I told you, when you came over, it reminded me of my parents immediately. I have my mother, this proletariat worker, working 3 shifts and sleepless all the time, always struggled with insomnia. As the exalted class member, she was the busiest in the family and was always away from us and never had enough sleep. Whereas my father, an engineer, a sort of, the intellectual that was banished from his office and so on, he was sidelined, but also lying down to enjoy his free time, sleep time, so to speak. So all of these, I think, are just tidbits of a constellation of incredible contributions you have made. But last, I also will share one takeaway as inspiration, but also as maybe a question for you and maybe for Jianzi here as well. I've been working on melodrama, the other side of of the modern media. I think we talk about revolution and cinema being co-constitutive, but also in our field, we've been talking about how modernity and cinema, in general, have been these Siamese twins. And roughly, we consider there are 3 family groups. There's documentary modes or media, and there's a melodramatic mode media, and there's the animation or animated mode of media. And the more I learn about each of them, the more I see them being so mutually implicated. And the many sections when you describe these films, including the fiction ones, the sort of staged ones, makes me think about a melodramatic approach to it. So I just leave that sort of on the table, for myself to think further. And maybe you would have something to say about it. Thank you.
Okay, and now Ying will have a chance to respond to the
Yes,
panelists.
and I will. I guess there are a few questions there, that was raised, but I just want to first thank all of you for reading reading the book so carefully and for teasing out ideas and interventions, and some of them I didn't even explicitly lay out, and so it's just wonderful to have readers like you. And I also want to say, I mean, actually, that this book, so much of it actually came from interacting with my colleagues. I'm Professor Zhang Zhen's work on on Shanghai cinema and vernacular modernism. This book, I mean, actually, the way that I went to the archival and to the historical, and then to sort of thinking about cinema in relation to, to various other histories, had a lot to do with that book. That book was the landmark that set the foundation for study of early cinema, Chinese cinema. And of course, you also worked so much on independent documentary, from which I also learned. And, the comparative media, Center for Comparative Media really helped me shape the book, because when I wrote the dissertation, I didn't have a vocabulary so much to really, I theorized to some extent, but I feel that the theorization couldn't be pushed to the way that I could be satisfied. And then at the Center for Comparative Media, I start to really think, and I think that Brian was exactly right, that I went to mediation rather than a representation in order for me to say that there are so many things, so many processes in the society that are mediating processes. And so, and film and culture are one among these and are intersecting with these processes. Because when I was writing my dissertation, I just felt that documentaries were embedded in all these productive and reproductive processes in the society. And I was writing about how the film opens up to any kind, there are all these people that previously I wouldn't even think it was related to film, but they all were brought in. And then so the film was really intricately related to everything else. And I didn't know, but then the film at that time, if you say it's a representation, then it's hard to actually move from the representation to all these, sort of processes, right? But actually media really helped me to write nimbly between these processes. And then, thinking about the party as media. And thinking about the party as media for me was really then think about the constructedness of the party, the contingency of the party, right? And so party media is really actually to say that, well, the party could have been different. And of course, think about the party, you also think about the party's internal communications. And when I talked about the Cultural Revolution, I also talked about the parties, the fallen leader, for example, was immediately cut off, right, from the internal party communication. And also, the exclusions and inclusions within the party organization and between the party and the masses. And so if you actually, so I think, Center for Comparative Media and using the mediation as a framework helps me to, because I think that one of the problems of, Chinese history, like the history of the Maoist period, is to see things in a very fixed way. So the state would only do this, but I think that really opens up. So for me, this was I think there was one moment when I suddenly felt that, from media studies, we could say something to history. We could say something to disturb some of the things that are fixed. And then we can actually say how it was made, how this was made. And I think in the end, this was, for me, what learning lessons from historical processes constitutes, right? Because you want to see this as, you want to see this as having a lot of the potentials, but somehow moving in certain directions, and you want to ask why. So the questions I had, so Lydia, thank you for the questions on the ephemeral, ephemeral sort of material of the early film. Early cinema, and Debashri also has written about this, just kind of the archive disappearing, and especially colonial archives or archives, in places with war, with regime change. And I encountered a lot of problems for early part. So I visited Hong Kong and Taiwan and visited the film archives there. I was very grateful for the research funding that Columbia had offered for me to visit these places. I also worked with, actually for pre-49, it was hard to find many films in collectors' hands. But post-49 films, a lot of them were in private collection. So I worked with these collectors to see these films, and later on, these collectors also digitize these films in very with very rudimentary means, and then sold them online. So a lot of the writing, like the first film I wrote about was 1906, a film in 1906, and I went to Japan. I could not find it, and it was a group of Chinese students making that film in Japan, and so I could rely only on their the published essays by one of the filmmakers on how the film was made. The fiction and documentary, that's such an important question for documentary studies, and I quoted, I think in the introduction from Jane, about the stakes on one hand, we now know that documentary, it has a lot of complex mediation, right? Documentary representation is a whole process of complex mediation. And so, but at the same time, we don't want to lose that evidential power, evidentiary power of the visible evidence, because so many so many socially disadvantaged groups, people who are less represented, they want to use the image to assert their situated knowledge, right? So how do we then, with this mediate? So how do we basically? I'm thinking about, and with propaganda also, I'm thinking about the evaluation. So how do we evaluate a fiction from another, right? Because everything it is a partial reality, no matter what, right? And I feel the only way to evaluate is actually to unfold that production, and is to think about it eventually, in the sense of, on one hand, what kind of actors were brought in, what kind of relationships were being made around the camera, and then on the other hand, how is this event being inscripted, and then knowing that our knowledge, the process of knowledge, is often that we have fixed ideas and we immediately label these events with fixed ideas. But what about the events? With the events also has the new, events is always related to the emergent and to the new. And so how then the inscription is really negotiating on how we capture that event. And of course, there are all kinds of interests, and there are all kinds of philosophical understanding of how things can be understood. What are the process of perception and understanding? So I think for propaganda and for fiction and documentary, in the end, it probably does not matter if something is a propaganda or not, right? What matters is what are the interests behind, and what it opens up, what it closes, what it excludes, and yeah. So I think that's the intervention. Yeah.
Now we can open the floor to questions and answers. Sure.
Hi, my name is Tian. We're happy to listen to your explanation and everyone's interpretation and review, and I'm also interested in the free copy. So my question will also start from Professor Larkin's. Well, I remember in your essay, The Poetics and Politics of Infrastructure, you said infrastructure as an objective, there are so many ways to analyze it. So how to do it, the method of analyzing is always a theoretical question. And so I'm very interested in Professor Qian's choice of methodology, and also especially in the theoretical framework of the event, because I understand your focus on the mediation, and you're highlighting the process of this mediation. Have you thought about other than event to also open up this conversation? Or why did you at the end choose event as this anchor to start this discussion? You mentioned the importance on the temporality or the before and after, and also film itself it's such a time-based medium. So I would just like to hear more about your thinking process and working process of how, like, about event as your theoretical framework.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. I think, so I mean, I guess, first of all, I just noticed, I mean, for documentary, I noticed how it's often the first responders to eruption of events, so especially when I look at early documentary, because now, like documentary, we have like stream media and so on, and we document our everyday life, and it's not so much about the eventfulness, even though we could still see that documentation as actually bringing an event to, and making it public. But I mean, in early documentary, it's really the war, the eruption of revolution or some kind of event. So it was, so the event, I think, had to do with thinking about the sort of what documentary responded to. It was always responding to some change. So it was just, documentary camera was just really attracted to change. So then, of course, I also start to think, so first of all, thinking about the event, you have a before and an after, right? And then before and after, there is a change. And so, but the after is very uncertain. And you can think about the revolution as really archetypical events, because the revolution really wanted to have an after that was very different from the before. And of course, there I think Alain Badiou's sort of event, when he thinks about revolution as event, also was an inspiration, but it was also a problem, because he, so on one hand, I think he really talks about knowledge formation. He helped me to think about knowledge formation, especially about, when you have a dominant kind of hegemony, and you have people being excluded, and it's the people who are being excluded who would raise the most radical proposals for change. But these radical proposals are actually not being understood by the dominant knowledge structure. So even in today's world, right, for marginalized groups to assert their identity, they often have to use the dominant language. And so that I thought was a very interesting problem. And then I thought that in the revolution, through the revolution, there was a hardening of the language. There was a hardening of the category, so that actually the revolution started to exclude, and it to the point of, not, it is, so the inclusion and exclusion, the economy changed through the revolutionary process. And so I took that event wanting to engage with that epistemology of revolution, but also want to problematize it, because for me, in the end, I find there's a lot of anti-event tendencies in the Cultural Revolution, which is then, allows me to make an argument against Badiou's understanding. Yes, I think that's the, yeah.
If I can just quickly jump in on that.
Yeah.
My thing on infrastructure was, I would just look at an infrastructure, and that would have an infrastructure. So if you look at the next level down, that would also have an infrastructure. And you kept moving in this recursive movement. So what the thing was to me wasn't obvious. And so if I relate it to the documentary in this, what's documentary?
Mhm.
So Ying looks at a lot of forms that don't quite rise to the level of documentary
Yeah.
traditionally, the newsreel, and also looks at things like reenactments, which have always been part of the debate around documentary, but then looks at enactments. They're not even reenactments, they're just stage films, which then gets to your point about how do you begin to tell the difference between these things? So the categorical thing, which is what you were troubling, is exactly here. It's not obvious what the documentary is. So then you produce the object you seek to analyze, which I think is exactly what you've done in this text.
Yeah, there's.
I was also following online in person. But yeah, to go back to like ephemeral media and sort of gaps and silences in the archive. This is a selfish question because this is something I'm thinking about as well, but are these merely obstacles to get at our research, or are there ways, like, how have you thought about theorizing these gaps and silences in relation to the event and its afterlives?
Yes. That's a great question. So when writing about Liu Nao, for example, so Liu Nao's amateur film practice, he actually hid it. So he renounced it, and you wouldn't see him mentioning it at all. So people who are looking at his film series, they would, I mean, my conclusion in the end was that his film practice, especially amateur film practice, really affected how his film series changed. If you just look at the film theory, you wouldn't understand it because it was so eclectic and it was so, it was shifting. But the fact that he renounced it was because he couldn't actually show people in Shanghai. He was working in Shanghai. He was a colonial subject from Taiwan, and he couldn't show where his hometown was because he said his hometown was from Fujian. And also, so he was also going to all these colonies and even to the metropole, right, to Tokyo. But then he didn't want to show, his colonial privilege, right? So because he was actually very precarious in Shanghai. So I said that in the book that his privilege and his precarity were linked. On one hand, he did have a lot of colonial privilege, but at the same time, in the end, he was assassinated. His position was in between nationalism and the empire, right? I mean, it was in between. He could not find his place, and so in the end, I found this document, which was I found it in the National Film Institute in Japan, and it was a pamphlet by amateur filmmakers, Japanese language publication in Shanghai in 1930. And then there is a name. It's Mo Sha Liu. It's Mo Sha, which is like Formosa, and Liu, which is Liu Nao. But it's of a different name. I mean, it's in Japanese. We can pronounce it in Japanese. So I inquired. I asked Takuya about it. But in the end, I had to guess. And I have to guess whether, because Liu Nao was making films. He was close to the Japanese community. So was this him or not? I cannot tell. It's a conjecture. But I think, but that also just for me shows that in this very complicated political terrain, there are so many hiding, so much obscuration, and even the documentary looks very transparent, but it's very opaque, and I couldn't unearth all the production, all the political process in the production. I can only see a bit of it, but I think what it gives us, and I think when we look at our social media today, it's completely opaque because there's all these algorithms. I think what it actually gives us is that vigilance, and also that empathy, empathy for things that are hidden, for various reasons. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I got the mic just because I sat right next to it. And thanks so much for the presentation. This is actually something that I've been wondering about as I joined your seminar this semester, because I found it really fascinating that when we come to think of the question of agitation or revolution, and also to put it into the history of documentary studies as well, it's the very kind of something that's always being returned on is the question of the body and the question of affect. It's also this question of and I think that's also partly where the discussion about melodrama just playing in the discussion, and even it's in but one way to tackle with this is maybe one to understand this kind of turn toward the affect is maybe a kind of reworking of the Marxist understanding of consciousness as the fundamental, the foundation for any kind of revolution to take place. The sort of melodrama of agitation through the body genre is kind of reworking that framework, and it's very influential in, as we talked about in class yesterday, in activist movements in, for example, Black feminist theory. The question of love is always brought brought up again and again as an alternative way of public making, mass making. It's something that moves beyond the representation of private interests and so on and so forth. So what I found so striking in reading the chapters is that you actually back to knowledge, to consciousness and epistemology. And I just wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by epistemology, and also what does it mean to make this move back? And this is not just a move backward, but there's a lot of different nuances on how to understand consciousness as well.
Wow, that's an amazing question. Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, yes, so epistemology in this book was is about sort of the deciding is about making the categories of analysis, you know, the concepts in which that you grasp things, and also defining fields of possible action, right? So I feel that this is important for a revolutionary process to kind of navigate all the decisions it had to make and then move to the next stage. So I really enjoy. I mean, I like scholarly works on affect and on melodrama, and I also think that I mean Jane has also written on melodrama and also almost the knowledge of it, right?
I'll say something here.
Yeah.
Because I think this is, thank you for bringing this up. I wanted first to commend my colleague for the concept of mobilization of emotions. I think this is really rich, and it also perhaps is an improvement on Eisenstein. And I always tell my theory students that Eisenstein is the beginning of affect theory. And don't certainly go to literary studies because they don't consider the signifiers. And so what it seems to me that you've done with the notion of the mobilization of emotions is that you've attached it to the two rhetorics, because documentary is a rhetoric, certainly it's a political rhetoric because you use it and clarify it for us, but melodrama is also a rhetoric. So what happens when these are two modes, not genres, when the two rhetorics in the same work? And it could be that and I like it that you're talking about basically recruitment, because it's a kind of emotional recruitment, ideological, political recruitment that goes on, and you maybe need both. However, it's often associated, melodrama is associated with the like too much, and documentary, if it's in fact that rhetoric of the sober, is too little. So it could be that there's, in some films that are extremely powerful and moving, and they're supposed to move it to revolutionary action. I love it that you consistently talk about the assumption within that political moment, that set of political moments, that people will act, but not in a behaviorist way, which is the problem with Eisenstein. And we didn't call him out for being a Pavlovian, but we should have when we were studying Eisenstein. So, but you, and I also think it's very excellent that you navigate and issues around that question of the event, and carefully, and also bring back propaganda, because it's not just this old Cold War concept.
Yes, so yeah, no, I think I agree with Jane on just the film often has both, often has affect and also kind of forming some kind of allowing to make some concepts, right? So the films that think and film also
So
feel.
it's not affect and intellect are not mutually exclusive in
Yeah,
your
they're not
worldview.
mutually exclusive. And I think you, Jane also has an article about melodrama and the dialectics, right? The Marxist dialectics being sort of played out in
Melodrama and Marxist theory.
yeah. So there is a thinking component, but I also think that, for me, I really value reflexivity. I want to bring back maybe not so much consciousness, but reflexivity. And I, because this is what the 30th, I mean, in chapter 2, when I talk about sort of the politics, the filmmakers really understood the politics of visibility and invisibility, and they start and even in melodramas there are reflexive moments in left-wing filmmaking. There's always so it wants to move you, but it pulls you back and let you critically look at things, because melodrama can also be reductive, right? It can say, this is evil and this is good and so on, and it pulls you back to think to think again about the processes. Maybe these are things are made, or so I think and then in the socialist period, I also traced the reflexivity, and then I find, for example, the film, why is it that the film becomes again more and more transparent? So where is that reflexivity? I believe, and I'm working on something in relation, that the reflexivity was being brought to the bureaucratic level, like in terms of the bureaucratic regulations of film production. And there's implications for that, I think. So yeah, so for me, that's why I brought it back. Yes.
I mean, I really appreciate the student commentary, because we had similar discussions in our seminar too. The moments, feel the mobilization of emotions at work, and the body genres invoked, and the theatricalization of politics and so on. Class struggle is melodrama, really. So along the sort of line of body and emotions, pathos, and so on, I, asked my student to write a mini review of the book this week, right after the session. And I said, I have an additional question. Is there a feminist agenda in the book? Because with all the discussions about body, melodrama, emotions, and so on, it's inevitably, this is a new historicism. I mean, revisionist feminist historiography in cinema studies. So I was looking for that everywhere, and at the moment I found them more apparent, the Liu section in some ways, and also the Wang Guangming,
The wife diplomacy,
diplomacy area.
Yeah.
Not that every book has to be, overtly sort of feminist when you write a history of media or film, but I thought something more of that would have been really energizing.
There is Donna Haraway, the situated knowledge. I think the whole idea of hard cinema and soft cinema is that the soft, I mean, as you said, like it is a critique of masculinist conception of what revolution should be. There is also the revolution can also be soft. I mean, that was the question I asked in relation to the hard and soft cinema debate. And I think sort of because I feel that revolution has often been imagined as affect, hot bodies on the street. But we also see hot bodies on the street, like the Occupy movement or other movements, right? In the end, it fractures, in the end, it kind of disappears. And I think revolution is as much about thinking, or, I say revolution, I can say any kind of social movement, right? Is as much about thinking as about, feeling. Both are needed. And sometimes when I'm not, and I think, a feminist approach, sort of think about them being together, think about, yeah.
Jane, you mentioned Eisenstein's theory as the beginning of ethic theory.
Yes.
I am a human this.
Actually, I agree with you. Oh, I agree with you.
Okay.
However, I also wanted to add, since Ying was talking about affect and thinking, exactly where does thinking begin in this process, right? And so that is related to the question about consciousness. If you go back to Eisenstein, he would not say class struggle is melodrama. He would probably say struggle is fundamental to social process. And that's how he understands, he thinks about his theory of montage, conflict, struggle, tension. These are the fundamental things that would create what he calls intellectual cinema. I mean, so so if we think of the beginning of affect theory as starting with Eisenstein, but then he is calling for intellectual cinema, right?
Yeah. However,
Where does thinking begin in Montage itself?
however, he doesn't pay attention to the structure, the narrative structure. If you look at strike, what drives the revolutionary movement? We have slaughter, okay, and we have the hanging, the worker who hangs himself. So that we have suffering. Okay, what is the basis of melodrama? Suffering. So there are aspects of suffering. I know because I've done an essay on strike as a melodrama. He's not alive, to really disagree with me anymore. But I clearly get the Montage and conflict is terribly important relative to Marxist dialectics. So we all get this. It's a translation in that form. However, the films don't necessarily work without the aspect of suffering as a consequence of basically class warfare.
Injustice.
Injustice. And what is it that we understand the most important reason for melodrama? Protest against injustice again and again.
What about intellectual cinema that he talks about? What does he mean by that?
Well,
It's related
to the structure. I mean,
yeah.
Class.
Where does thinking begin? That was my question.
well, okay, so the point is that perhaps he's overriding those aspects of suffering and consequently injustice against which the workers have to rise up. And so he downplayed it, but then there's the question of the viscerality of his films. They're very, very, that's where affect theory comes in. Very, very visceral. And how is the visceral connected with the intellectual? I toss that back to the students. Because historically they've been separate. You're going to wrap us up.
A perfect place to. Back to the students with their free books and everyone else, buy your book, buy your books and continue the discussions. And thank you again so much.